Philosophical theories of shared intention tend to be rather bold. They require either quite complicated constructions, or else they might introduce some normative, ontological or conceptual innovations, quite bold ones. So we might end up with something like plural subjects with group minds or some other bold innovation. Before we do any of that, I think it's a really good idea to try to see what's wrong with the simplest theory of joint action that we can think of. So this is the simplest theory of joint action that we can think of. It's not exactly something that you find in the literature, but I take it that everybody would agree that their own philosophical theory is only worth considering if they can show what's wrong with this simple theory and how their approach addresses that mistake. So although I'm not offering this as something which I will defend seriously in the course, it's a useful tool. You have to be able to see what, if anything, is wrong with this in order to accept another theory. And I mean this quite seriously because I actually think that it's quite hard to show that any of the other theories are better than the simple theory. I'm not sure that you will be able to do that or that anybody can. Right? Although, of course, there I'm in a minority of one amongst the philosophers, so don't trust me on that. As you remember, our question is what distinguishes joint action from parallel but merely individual actions. That's the kind of simple organizing question that we want in order to try to understand more broadly the forms of joint action that are important for human sociality. So if we're trying to answer that question, it's a bit like the question, which events are actions? And what you saw in the case of which events are actions is that there is a standard solution to that question. And the idea is that those events are actions which stand in a certain relation to intentions, right? So when you've got an event appropriately related to an intention, that is thereby an action. So if we're asking a parallel question, which events are joint actions, then there's a very tempting thought here, right? So the event is going to stand in some relation to something that is the counterpart of an intention for the joint case, and it will thereby be a joint action. This is so overwhelmingly tempting, actually, that you'll see almost every philosophical theory has this structure. Almost, but not quite, every philosophical theory has this structure. So let's try to create something with that structure. We've got our joint actions here, we've got our parallel actions here. We need to distinguish between the two. What we've just seen is that we can't do this merely by appealing to coordination or common effects. So perhaps no other superficial, observable features of the situation will allow us to do this. Perhaps we need to take a step back and think about what is happening in the agents' minds. Maybe there is some kind of intention-like state that is causing the event, and that's what makes it a joint action. So here's the simple theory. The idea is this. We intend that you and I, cycle to school together. When you and I have that intention, and when it's appropriately related to our actions, well, then we're acting jointly. So what distinguishes the two sisters cycling together from the two strangers cycling side by side is that the two sisters intend that the two sisters cycle to school together, whereas the strangers cycling side by side have no such intention. And you kind of see that makes some sort of sense. So think about what happens if, as the people are cycling along, one of them just falls into a massive hole and doesn't get to school at all. Now, as far as the strangers go, they might be entirely successful in everything that they intend because their intentions didn't concern anybody but themselves. Whereas for the sisters, if they intend that the two sisters cycle to school together and one of them falls into a massive hole and never makes it, then that would count as failure. So on the face of it, the simple theory of joint action allows us to distinguish joint actions from parallel but merely individual actions. So let me make the parallel with the individual action case explicit. If we ask the question about individual action, what distinguishes your ordinary individual action from a mere happening, calling this the problem of action, the standard solution says, look, it's your intention that you throw coffee at me. Right? That's what made it an action and not something where you just, your arm moved and you say, oh, I'm so sorry, that wasn't an action, it was just something that happened to me. Don't worry, wiping the coffee off my face. The intention is what makes the difference between an action and something that happens to you. Parallel question for joint action. What distinguishes joint from parallel but merely individual actions? That's our intentions that you and I cycle to school together. Very, very simple. Now, I just want to fancy this up very, very slightly because some of these details could be important when we're trying to consider objections to the simple theory. So if we're being really careful, we will express the simple theory in this form. This is its canonical form that you can see in the glossary on the handouts. So the simple theory says, two or more agents perform an intentional joint action exactly when there is some act type such that each agents intend that these agents phi together, and then their intentions are appropriately related to their actions. Now, with it spelled out like that, let's just have a look at a few tiny features. So the first thing is the idea of an act type here that may not be familiar to everybody, but it's very simple. Suppose that you intervene in a very timely way. So there's our boss up there who's saying something profoundly silly, and you manage to make exactly the right comment, which is kind of a put down, but the boss doesn't realise. And I might think to myself, I wish I had done that. I wish I had done that. And what I mean there is not, of course, that I wish kind of impossibly that I would have been the agent of an event where you were actually the agent of, right? That couldn't happen, right? Because I take it that what makes the event, the thing with a concrete date and time, what makes that event the thing that it is partly its causes. So there's no way that I could have been the agent of that event, right? That's kind of impossible, completely impossible. Just couldn't happen because it wouldn't be that event if I was the agent of it instead of you. What I must be thinking instead is that I wish that I had performed an action of just that type, that I had said the thing that you said. So the act type is not something with a date and a time, but rather something that you can perform and I can perform. We can perform actions of the same type, coming up with that creative put down. The phi here is just something that stands in for any particular action. So you would substitute phi for, what did we have before? Cycling to school together, something like that. Cycling to school. We don't want the together in there because we've added that afterwards for good reasons. So you replace the phi with cycling to school or making coffee or whatever it might be, and then you've got the simple theory or an instance of the simple theory, and the idea is it's true no matter what you put there for phi. And this is more substantial. What you'll notice here is that we've stuck in intentional joint action. So we're not saying something about joint action, we're saying something about intentional joint action. Now, why are we doing that? Well, practically all of the philosophers focus on intentional joint action only, and their view seems to be that either there is no joint action other than intentional joint action, or if there is, it's of absolutely no interest or relevance. Now, if you've been following along the first part of the course, you will have been thinking about intentional versus other kinds of instrumental action, and it should be far from obvious to you that all actions are intentional actions. So by comparison, it might be less obvious to you that we should be focusing here on intentional joint action. But in this part of the lectures, I want to make it independent of that early part of the course, and I want to follow as much as possible the standard philosophical approaches, at least initially. We need to understand them before we attempt to either accept them or revise, refine, reject them. And therefore, I'm going to focus on intentional joint action, and that's what the simple theory does too. Very good. The last thing to say here is that we are attempting to offer at the beginning both necessary and sufficient conditions, and that may well be too much. It may be too much to attempt to offer necessary and sufficient conditions, so we may eventually have to back off this, and we may have to recognise that the account needs to be refined in some way, so that, for example, not every intentional joint action necessarily involves an intention. There may be other ways to get here, for example. So then we might say, look, well, this is sufficient but not necessary. And that by itself would be some kind of progress. But for now, we're going to start off with the most easily refutable view by making it as strong as possible, and that means necessary and sufficient conditions. The other thing you might notice is this term appropriately related here. I'm not going to say anything about that other than to say, look, you don't need to worry about that, but if you have seen a section that mentions deviant causal chains in the individual action part, you'll know roughly what this is about. This is there for the same reason that we have appropriately related in the standard solution to the individual case as well. But if that doesn't mean anything to you, don't worry about it. Let's just move on. Nothing is going to hang on that in what follows. We're going to factor that out as a problem. Very good. So here's the simple theory. The simple theory says, in effect, that for us to be performing a joint action, as opposed to be acting in parallel but merely individually, we have to have some intention that we, you and I, cycle to school together. So the simple theory. Let's try and find out what might be wrong with the simple theory.